Hello, hello. Welcome to Housing is a Human Right, our new webinar series here with the Charter for Compassion. My name is Felipe Zurita, and I am part of the Charter for Compassion staff. I'm very happy to welcome you all to our third installment of this webinar series. We are very lucky to have Dan Bryant and Andrew Heben from SquareOne Villages located in Oregon here in the United States. We're very excited to hear about their project. And as you know, last week we had Amber Fogarty from Community First Village in Austin, Texas, and it was a great session. So this session will be all about SquareOne Villages, and at the end we'll have time to do a Q&A. So if you are, wondering about questions someone else, please put them on the chat, put them in the Q&A, and we will try to really go through all of them again as we did last week so that we can answer all your questions. But I'm sure that the presentation that Andrew and Dan gives us will have a lot of those answers in it. So just know that this video is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel, and also will be premiered on Facebook Live or Facebook premiere on Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific. So you'll be able to have a live chat there as well. So with that, we leave you here with Dan and Andrew so that they can take us with SquareOne Villages.
Thanks, Philippe. This wonderful opportunity to share with you. We are sharing from Eugene, Oregon, where it's a little bit cooler than it was in Austin last week. Eugene, for those who don't know, is home of Tracktown, USA. We featured the World Championship track and field meet here just a couple of weeks ago. And home of the Oregon Ducks. It's a great place to be. Wonderful to be a part of this program and to share with you something that's just very close to my heart in the work that we are doing here at SquareOne Villages. I'm actually, by profession, a pastor. I served for 29 years as the pastor of First Christian Church, Disciples of Christ in the heart of Eugene, very historic building, built in 1911, that's frequently used as one of the icons for our city. So the first question people might ask is, why is a pastor of a historic church like this in the business of doing affordable housing? Well, at a downtown church like ours, you don't need to look for the unhoused because they come to you. They're literally on your doorstep day and night. And our ministries for and with the unhoused grew every year I was there as we sought to deal with the constant need that came to our front doors. And over the years, we developed a number of ministries to assist people who came to the church seeking our help, people who were cold and hungry, needing the most basic necessities, and just a place to sleep. And I think we're all aware with the issues of homelessness. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons for that today. I just want to make a general comment about the crisis that we are experiencing here, especially on the West Coast. You know, there's often a stigma and a shame that comes with being homeless. But I think the real shame is that we have made it nearly impossible for the poorest of the poor to live with any dignity among us. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights calls housing a human right, the theme of this seminar. Federal courts here on the West Coast, at least, have stipulated that it is cruel and unusual punishment to criminalize that which human beings must do to survive when they have nowhere else to go. This is known as the Boise decision, named for a case that came out of Boise, Idaho. And congregate shelters, I think, have been the predominant model for shelter in this country for decades, or probably over a century or more. But they do not meet the needs of many of the unhoused for a whole host of reasons. And I think, as we especially saw over the last couple of years, they are very challenging during a pandemic, when sheltering a bunch of people in a common room is the very last thing you want to do. We actually began creating here in our community alternatives to that kind of model, things like the car camping program that was begun in 1997 and was administered by a nonprofit, St. Vincent de Paul, using parking lots, and particularly church parking lots around our community. And we at First Christian Church began housing unhoused people in trailers and conestogas, we call them. I'll speak a little bit more about that later. Providing shelter to over 150 people in the alley behind the church over a 20-year period. And then in our community, we created warming centers. We called them the Egan warming centers, named after Major Thomas Egan, a gentleman who froze to death on the streets of Eugene in 2008, was served in the military reserves, was fairly well known by a number of people. And so it was in his memory that we created this program using a dispersed model, again, run by St. Vincent de Paul, with various churches. And our church, being a downtown location, served as the central hub for those warming centers. And we would transport people from our site to the other locations around our community, and then would house about 80 to 90 people in our basement until we had to shut it down when the fire marshal determined that we didn't have fire sprinkling, and therefore it was not a safe enough building for people to be sleeping overnight. Then also that same year, we started in our church a free breakfast on Sunday mornings with the help of 3 other congregations, serving over 300 people every Sunday, until the pandemic forced us to close that down. But at the time, it was the largest meal site of our city. All told, over a year's time, we had well over 20,000 contacts with unhoused people every year. And typically in this community, where we see in the neighborhood of 2,500 to 3,000 unhoused people on any given night, we only have 550 shelter beds. That means 1 out of every 8 people that are unhoused gets a bed. The other 7 have no place to go. So it's no wonder we have so many people camping out on our streets. And over half of those have some type of disability, with mental illness being the most frequent. A third of those folk are chronically unhoused. In 2011, there was a protest, many people remember, called Occupy Wall Street. And in Eugene, there were a number of people that began protesting in solidarity with the folks on Wall Street. And as they were doing in Wall Street, they began camping out on public property. And because it was a protest, the city determined that they had to allow it to happen. Well, the unhoused members of our community thought, great, you figured out a way to legally camp. Can we join you? And the folks in that protest movement said, sure. And so they developed this relationship between housed and unhoused folk. And in the aftermath, the mayor, it was closed down at the end of 2011, the mayor established a task force to study this issue and to come up with some recommendations of what we could do in our community to provide a safe legal place for more people to sleep who did not have housing. At the same time, I and others in part of that movement teamed up with this guy, Andy Heben, who is an urban planner by trade, had just recently moved to Eugene, came in with lots of ideas, and even wrote a book about it, describing our work to create our non-congregate shelter, Opportunity Village, I'll speak about in just a moment. And 3 other projects with which he was very familiar, one of which where he actually lived for a period. And so we began developing this concept of how to create an alternative styled shelter using, we called them tiny homes at the time. They're not really homes, but sleeping cabins. And we built this from the ground up with just volunteers. We were an all volunteer organization, no staffing of any kind. And we called this SquareOne Villages because we are helping people to start over again, creating democratically run villages of tiny homes for people in need of housing. So when that mayor's task force recommended that the city create new places where the unhoused could sleep, we were ready with our proposal, Opportunity Village Eugene. And we asked the city to designate an acre of property of land that they owned where we could start this pilot project and demonstrate these concepts of a semi-self-managed community with these tiny structures. And give us 1 year to demonstrate it. Well, that was 9 years ago, and we're still there. So we've proven the concept and indeed have a lot of support from our city for that. So we began in August of 2013 building a village. It took us about 9 months to build for about 35 people, all with volunteer labor, with the exception of one carpenter that we paid to provide some oversight. And these structures we created are very simple structures, 8x8, 8x10. The 8x10s intended for couples. Originally had no electricity or even heat, although we did add electricity and heat last year. We also have solar power now on most of our units. And we have 20 of these bungalows, as we call them, and then another 10 Conestogas. We call them that because they look like a Conestoga wagon. Those were created by a different nonprofit, Community Supported Shelters here in Eugene, that has now built over 250 of these, scattered throughout the city in various different programs and in that car camping program I mentioned earlier. And in addition to our site at Opportunity Village, we have another site that we just opened up recently that has 19 of these Conestogas and then another 20 bungalows. The village, Opportunity Village, has a large yurt that serves as the community living room where weekly meetings are held, and all villagers are required to attend those meetings. The yurt is heated by a pellet stove, has electricity, variety of small appliances, microwaves, coffee machines, and the like, several computers. We also provide broadband internet access because that's an essential utility these days for anyone to receive services or to apply for housing and the like. And the village has become an attractive little community of its own. The average stay is about 12 to 18 months, though there is no maximum length of stay, but all the residents are expected to be working on a transition plan while they are at the village. And we have things like raised garden beds, laundry facilities, a small office. We have a couple of projects that were built by university students, including these garden boxes that are actually used to recycle gray water and where trees are grown for the city's forestry department. We have a bathhouse with 2 toilets, a shower, washer and dryer. The cost of building this village is just a little over $200,000, but half of that was in-kind donations. And then it operates on a budget of about $10,000 a month, which comes out to less than $10 per night per bed. The villagers themselves pay $35 a month as a participation fee, and all are required to do 10 hours of service in the village to help maintain it and to run it. Our philosophy is not to create shelter for the unhoused, but with them. So they are very involved in the operation of the facility. We do it with a single half-time staff member who is at the village. So it's almost self-managed, not entirely. You know, we do provide that oversight, and that helps us keep the operational cost low. We designed and built it with the villagers themselves. I mentioned that Sunday breakfast. We went to that breakfast and had made an announcement there and had 15 people that began meeting on a monthly basis who were unhoused individuals that helped us set up the program, create the rules for it, the community agreements. And then when it came to building it, and many of the villagers pitched in, like Juan here, who helped us roof, you know, because preachers with seminary training, you know, have so much experience roofing, right? And Juan perceived that I could use a little help, and turns out he was a professional roofer by trade. And when I got off the roof, the work went a lot faster. And Juan went on to roof several of the other buildings there, including his own little home. And that's typical of just the kind of help that we've had from many of our villagers. Our biggest problem is that helping the villagers find a way to transition out, to find actual affordable housing, because we had a number of villagers who had income. They had jobs, they had disability income, they had Social Security, but the cost of housing, frankly, is unaffordable. And when you look at the statistics from our housing authority, you can see why. The wait time back in 2014, when I took this slide, and that's Juan there with his wife standing in front of their unit, the wait time to get into housing for families seeking a 3-bedroom apartment typically was 1 year. Families needing 2 to 4 bedrooms, the wait time was 2 to 3 years. But if you're a couple without any children or a single individual and all you need is a studio or a single bedroom apartment, the wait time was over 6 years. And frankly, I knew many of our people did not have that long to wait. One in particular was in very poor health, went on to oxygen device after we took this picture, and eventually, sadly, he passed away before we were able to get him housed. So why is it that we have such a dearth of affordable housing? There was a study done in Oregon by María Memorial Trust that established that building affordable housing was actually 25% more expensive than market rate housing due to the various requirements you have to meet when you receive public dollars. And at that time, they found that the average cost for affordable housing was $226,000 per unit. Today, the cost is closer to $300,000. And just a few weeks ago, I saw an article that said there were 7 different projects in the state of California where the cost was over $1 million per unit of housing. And in our community, where we need 4,000 units of housing to provide adequate housing for the people here in need, that would be over $900 million, whereas the entire city budget is $860 million. So clearly we cannot build our way out of this crisis just using the current models of affordable housing. So we decided we needed to get in the business of building our own, to find a different way to do that and to use some of the things that we learned from creating that non-congregate shelter. And so we call our first project Emerald Village Eugene, which I like to say, Eve is the mother of tiny home villages. Purchased an acre of land in 2015 and began working with the prospective residents to build it in 2017. We had a team of 13 different architects, all donating their services, and then builders as well that donated their services, and built 22 super affordable tiny homes that average from 160 to 300 square feet, where the carrying charge or the rent is just $250 to $350 a month. The total project budget was about $1.8 million, but $500,000 of that was in-kind donations, including $120,000 from the city to pay our system development charges. Now, these homes are simple, but they're not cheap. They're quality built, very livable, full bath and kitchenettes. They cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $45,000 to $50,000 to build, plus the land and the infrastructure of about another $30,000. So it's about a third of the typical cost of most affordable housing projects. And the end result is a very attractive village that was appraised at $3 million. I think would be welcome in almost any neighborhood, providing long-term permanent solution for many who cannot afford traditional housing. Like our friend Alice, one of our senior citizens who thought she could take advantage of Social Security and retired at the age of 62 and was in shock when she received her first check and discovered that her Social Security was less than her rent. Alice is not a financial planner, but she's a wonderful person and a great community member, and has done a lot of work to support this kind of project. She was smart enough to know that it was not good to have an eviction on her record, and so she voluntarily moved out when she couldn't afford to pay her rent. She camped out for the summer in the forest, came to Opportunity Village when she woke up one morning surrounded by ice and everything was frozen. And she stayed with us for 2 years before she moved into Emerald Village. On that day she moved in with tears in her eyes, and I think most of the rest of us as well, she spoke about how she thought she was going to spend the rest of her life living in a shelter. One of our younger residents was LeBeau, pictured here speaking at one of our annual fundraising events. LeBeau took a lot of pride in his home, chose the colors, a very colorful person, spent over 400 hours working on it. Was always willing to show off his home whenever we had people coming through on tours. LeBeau told us this literally saved his life. On his disability income, he was forced to live with someone who was abusive. So moving into his own home where he could afford to pay the rent on his income was a lifesaver. Similar to manufactured homes, parks, we have a what you might call a clubhouse, a common building with a full kitchen, so that when you have a big birthday party or you want to just entertain some friends, you have a space to do that, as well as a place for committee meetings and board meetings and the like. The village also has laundry facilities and things like garden beds and a greenhouse and other things that they share. Now, unlike most affordable housing projects, the residents of Emerald Village are not simply renters. They actually own the co-op, which leases the facility from the nonprofit, and they have a membership share in the co-op valued at $1,500, so that they have an ownership stake in this project. They pay off that membership share over time, 30 months, $50 a month, and that's part of that $250 to $350 charge that I cited earlier. So in other words, after 30 months, what they actually pay goes down. Where else does that happen? And they are in charge of the project. They are their own landlords, so they determine the rent that is actually paid by their members. And collect that. So we get a single check from the co-op. And this last year, they decided for the first time since we opened that they needed to raise the rent. I think it was just $5 or $10 in order to meet their budget. But my point is, they make that decision. We don't make that decision. And of course, the greatest benefit is that they have that sense of being in charge of their own housing and take responsibility for that, as well as receive the benefit from it. So we are not just building affordable housing, we seek to build small communities where residents are empowered by working together to create not only a place to call home, but greater stability in their lives and in a new future. And we wanted to see if we could replicate this model in a rural community. So we went to Cottage Grove, a small community south of Eugene with about 10,000 residents, and created Cottage Village, very similar to Emerald Village with 13 tiny homes. The cost per unit there is a little bit higher because we don't have quite the same economies of scale, and there's a little bit more expense in developing the property. But still less than half the cost of most affordable housing projects. And then this last September, we opened our newest project. We call it the C Street Project. It's located on C Street in Springfield. And we call this our micro village. From the outside, it looks just like a normal home, except that it is divided into 4 units, so essentially a quad. Single bedroom, and then in the back is an accessory dwelling unit that's a duplex, so that on a standard home lot, we are providing housing for 6 households, mostly single individuals and couples. We have one mom with a child, but we're able to do this for $100,000 per unit. Again, a half to a third of the cost of most affordable housing. And the real beauty of this project is the legal structure, which we believe offers residents greater financial stability and even more ownership in their housing. And with that in mind, I'd like to turn this over to my partner, Andy, who will describe that structure. So Andy, take it away.
Sure, thank you, Dan. Let me pull up my slides here real quick. And so, yeah, Dan did a nice job kind of telling our story. And, I think a lot of times people are attracted to our work by the images of the tiny homes. I'm going to hit you with a few text slides here because I think if we really want to provide long-term stability and compassion to our residents as affordable housing developers, then ownership structure is really kind of central to the conversation, especially if we want to reframe housing to be more about the people who live there than the real estate market. And so traditionally, we have the two conventional options of, a rental apartment, or a single family home ownership. In rental housing, low-income residents lack control, security of tenure, and equity. And in subsidized low-income housing, once the 15 to 30-year affordability requirement expires, that housing is also subject to those unfortunate consequences. And then it's also important to remember that homeownership is not a one-size-fits-all solution. So in traditional single-family home ownership, low-income households don't reap the benefits that higher incomes households do, due to the location and the condition of the housing that they can afford, and due to a lack of timing around flexibility of purchasing and selling the home. So there is a third option, which is shared equity home ownership, which we believe promotes permanent affordability and sustainable wealth building for low-income housing. And there's two main types of shared equity home ownership: community land trusts and limited equity co-ops. So I'll give you a quick overview of both of those. Community land trust realizes affordability by dividing ownership of the land and ownership of the buildings and improvements, thereby mitigating speculative market forces. Typically, a household owns its own individual dwelling unit, while the CLT retains title to the underlying land. And then a long-term ground lease connects the household to the land trust, and it is used to enforce affordability controls. And the CLT goes on to provide training and support to the homeowners. The main weakness of this model on its own is that each family still is required to qualify for a mortgage. The land trust owns the land, and then each family owns their own home on the land. So it's a great model for a certain demographic, but it's not accessible to very low income households when you're looking at under 60% AMI and sometimes up to 80% AMIs, where they might not be able to qualify for a mortgage as an individual household. The other model is a limited equity cooperative, which realizes affordability through shared resources, self-management, and operating at costs. In a co-op, multiple households join together to collectively own multiple dwelling units on a single property by forming a cooperative corporation. Each household purchases a membership share in the co-op, granting them a right to each dwelling unit, a vote in the co-op's governance, and an ownership stake. And in a limited equity co-op, it preserves long-term affordability by limiting the appreciation and value of the membership share with a simple formula. So oftentimes in a limited equity co-op, the maximum resale value of that share is limited to, say, 3 to 5% to keep pace with inflation, versus a market rate co-op where the share can escalate for whatever the market will bear. So there's that upfront cost to move in, and then members pay a monthly carrying charge to the co-op to cover all operating costs, including utilities, insurance, maintenance, reserve funds, and any debt service. And so a lot of co-ops were actually built in the 60s and 70s using public subsidies. And one weakness of this model is that in a hot housing market, members may be enticed to amend their bylaws and convert to a market rate co-op in order to cash out their shares at whatever the market will bear. And so kind of through this story that Dan told with Opportunity Village and then Emerald Village and then Cottage Village, we kind of were learning along the way, kind of becoming housing developers from the ground up. And we received a grant to kind of further research and develop the housing model we were working on. And we came to the conclusion that combining the community land trust and the limited equity co-op was a really sustainable model forward. So in this model, the community land trust owns the land, and then rather than each family owning their own home on that land, they come together to form a cooperative corporation. The cooperative owns the buildings and operates similarly to a limited equity co-op that I described on the last slide. And this graphic down here kind of shows, it's kind of a foreign concept to a lot of folks because it's outside of those two traditional forms of rental and traditional single family home ownership. This graphic is kind of designed to explain how the relationships work. So the community land trust owns the land. The limited equity co-op owns the improvements on the land. There's a long-term ground lease that ties the interests of both of those parties together. And then there's the relationship between the limited equity co-op and the individual members. So each member signs a proprietary lease and pays a monthly carrying charge to the co-op to live there. And they also sign a membership agreement and purchase a share in the co-op to become co-owners of that cooperative corporation. The primary advantages that we find with this model is that it's an accessible form of home ownership. So rather than each of these individual residents having to qualify for a bank mortgage individually, the limited equity co-op can qualify for a single blanket mortgage. And then each member helps pay off that, that debt service through the monthly carrying charge. The other is permanent affordability. So that's built into the housing through the legal documents in the ground lease and the co-op's bylaws, which state that the housing has to remain affordable to a certain income level for the duration of the lease. And these leases are typically 99 years. And then third, we think it's a very low risk investment because it's a multi-layered ownership structure that ensures a safe and stable investment. So there's multiple backstops here where if there's an issue with an individual household, the co-op has an interest in stepping in and remedying the situation. And if the co-op runs into trouble, there's also the relationship with the community land trust that also can step in and remedy the situation. So we've developed four co-ops to date, the first being in 2018, which Dan introduced with Emerald Village. This is actually a leasehold co-op, not a limited equity co-op, in that the residents formed a co-op, but they lease both the land and the buildings from SquareOne Villages. We were kind of still figuring out our ownership structure when we started this project, and you'll see how it kind of evolves with future projects. But yeah, 22 units here, permanently affordable to folks earning under 50% area median income. And a lot of it was done by in-kind donations. We had 13 different architect design build teams that donated the homes. So this is kind of an example of how a local community can come together around a common cause and produce housing at a very low cost while providing quality and stable housing to low-income residents. Cottage Village came next in 2020, which is very similar to the Emerald Village model, but in a smaller rural community. Due to density standards, we were only able to put 13 units on this lot, also permanently affordable to households under 50% area median income. And then in 2021, we built the C Street Co-op, which is the first kind of implementation of the ownership structure I explained earlier with the Community Land Trust Limited Equity Co-op. It's built on a single family lot, and it's designed to look like a single family house and with an accessory dwelling unit in the back, as you can see on the site plan here. But the single family house is actually divided into 4 one-bedroom suites, each with their own bathroom and kitchen. And the ADU is divided into 2 one-bedroom suites. So there's a total of 6 one-bedroom units on the property, which due to this small scale project and the simple construction, we were able to build this for $100,000 per unit. And it only costs $20,000 per unit in subsidy, which is significantly lower than your traditional low-income housing development. This project serves 60 to 80% area median income, so low income, whereas our other projects had been a bit lower than that. But we wanted to create a model that we felt could be very replicable in that, this is a small scale project on its own, but it utilizes a very typical single family lot. And we believe a lot of these could be built throughout the community, especially here in Oregon, where there's been recent land use changes that has basically outlawed single family zoning and has allowed infill and the addition of 4 to 6 units on any single family lot here in Eugene and other Oregon cities. So we're pretty excited about this model. It's a smaller scale than our other projects, but we also think that there's scalability due to the low cost of it and the recent land use changes that would allow this to happen on more lots in Oregon. And our current project, where we're scheduled to break ground here in September, actually, is putting that model to scale. So Peace Village Co-op will provide 70 units of permanently affordable housing. It's serving a lower income demographic than C Street at serving households under 60% AMI, which is a demographic that's otherwise relegated to rental housing. Most public subsidies and incentives for serving folks under 60% AMI assumes rental housing, and that's what gets built. So we're very excited about this project, creating a limited equity co-op for 70 very low income households. We were approached by Peace Presbyterian Church. That's this existing building that you see here in the video. It's a very small congregation on a very large 3.6 acre lot. It's kind of a dwindling congregation in that they're down to just 30 members in their church. And they wanted to find a way to kind of further their mission by selling the property to SquareOne Villages and allowing us to develop affordable housing on the property while they still utilize the church for their services. The main constraint with this model is access to public funding and public incentives for developing affordable housing. As Dan was saying, you know, the cost of building housing these days is very expensive, and to do a large scale project like Peace Village at 70 units, it requires a significant amount of funding. It's about an $11 million project at $160,000 per unit is what's coming in to be built by a general contractor. But the problem here is that our public funding is kind of stuck in that rental or home ownership state of mind. And as you see here in the 2021 to 2023 biennium for our state housing authority, 98% of those resources for new construction is specific to rental housing. So you have to build rental housing with that money. And just 2% is available for new construction home ownership, which is where shared equity home ownership gets placed. And it's also problematic because that 2% for home ownership is also assuming fee simple single family home ownership. And so it's not exactly super compatible with cooperative housing, though I think we are making good progress on that. And Oregon Housing and Community Service just the legislature provided funding to create a new, more flexible homeownership program for this purpose. So I think there is progress being made on that front, and that's kind of the next stage to do more of this and kind of really bring it to scale is talking with state legislature and your state housing authority and figuring out how to adjust funding sources to be more compatible with this type of ownership structure. So that's the end of my slides here. I don't know, Dan, do you have anything more else you wanted to add, or do you want to open it up to questions?
Let me just share a couple of things. I think I fixed my internet issue, so hopefully I'll be able to do this. Andy, let's see here. Okay, I've got it. I just wanted to end with this kind of inspirational moment. You have to remember I'm a preacher by trade, right? So I showed this picture earlier of our group at Emerald Village, the residents working on the project, and I'm using it again to call attention to the wall of the building next to the project. You see there on the right with all of its graffiti. We hired a muralist, and the muralist spent 3 months dialoguing with the villagers of what they wanted to see when they got up in the morning. And she created this absolutely incredible mural full of images of new life. So you see the butterflies, and next to that, there's a forest that is burned and is coming back to life. And in the middle, there's a tree. They call it the tree of life. It looks like a dead tree, but there's new life coming out of its base. And then at the far end is a campfire with images of the villagers in silhouette dancing around the fire. And then you see this image of this phoenix rising out of the ashes. And I just love that image of creating new life for our villagers. It's just a great symbol that says it all, as we seek to provide a place where everyone belongs, that every person may find a place to call home. And as we like to say, it all begins at square one. So there's my contact info. Andy's is the same, Andrew at squareonevillages.org. Glad to respond to individual questions. We also provide consultations for a lot of folk. You can sign up on our website at squareonevillages.org for a consultation. Small fee involved in that, just to help to support the nonprofit. So glad to respond to any questions that folks have.
First of all, thank you so much, Dan and Andrew, for your presentation. We're truly grateful that you're able to share a lot more about your project. And I'm so sorry, but I forgot to introduce Susan at the beginning of the webinar. Susan, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Sillay with the Charter for Compassion. So happy to be part of this series with you. So one question came through, and then I also have some questions that I've written down through your presentation. And the one question was, how do you select who lives there? What's that process?
So we started, and I didn't describe this, when we started our first project, Opportunity Village, I mentioned the Sunday breakfast we had at the church. I actually made an announcement at the breakfast to describe what we wanted to do and said, if there's anyone that would like to stay behind and talk with us about this project. And about 30 people did. And then that group weeded itself out to 15. And we met with those 15 people for 3 months. And then when we opened the village, one of those found housing. So we had 14, and that provided the nucleus of our first village. And they set up the community agreements. So we worked with another group in Portland called Dignity Village that had gone through this process about a decade earlier. And we developed the community rules, and everybody signed on to that. So we had this nucleus of a community when we started. And from there on, they had their own selection committee. We staffed it, supported it, did some background checks as people, but they chose the people. And that's the way our projects have been ever since. We set up the village, we do the initial selection, and similar with, as you might with any kind of rental project, typical background checks. You want to make sure that people can afford even your modest charge, because nobody wants to have to evict someone because they can't afford to pay. So we're looking for people in that first project that had about a minimum of $600 of monthly income, hopefully 3 times the rent, so $750 to $900 ideally. And then, are they a person that can help run the village? Do they understand this is a community where they have a role to play? They have responsibilities. It's not your standard landlord-tenant relationship, where you just call up the landlord anytime you have an issue. You've got to figure out how to fix things yourself. We're not your landlord. And are they going to work collaboratively well with the rest of the village? So those are the kind of the primary factors. But then again, the membership committee in each village, after the initial village is formed, that membership committee is the group that decides and chooses its members. You of course have to follow fair housing law and make sure that you're not just discriminating against anyone. And of course we prioritize people that are below 80% or hopefully even less in terms of area median income.
Thank you. That piggybacks with the question I had. Amber had mentioned that you must be homeless for at least a year within the Austin area to be part of Community First Village. Do you have some criteria like that?
I just have to say, I just had to chuckle when that question was asked. We get that same question. Everyone I talk to who's doing this work gets that same question. If you build this, won't you just attract more homeless people to our community? We've done presentations in over 20 states, and we get the same question everywhere we go. If we build this, won't we just attract? Well, we can't all be attracting homeless people, right? It just doesn't make any sense. So first of all, and I loved her answer to that. We don't have that kind of requirement that says, you absolutely have to be, here for a year kind of thing. We do prioritize local folk. What we did with Emerald Village, because and the other question is the NIMBY, how you deal with NIMBYism, right? We have always engaged the neighborhood before we build our project. In fact, with Emerald Village, we started talking to the neighborhood association before we even called the realtor to ask about purchasing that land. We went to them first, said, this is what we want to do, got their support for the project. And as part of that, in our conversation with them, we asked them, what can we do? One of the things we did was we said, how about if we give a member of your neighborhood association a seat at the table so that you're involved in the selection process? So you have an idea of the kind of people that we're attracting, and that really appealed to them. And then we developed, good neighbor kind of agreements and a process for what to do if there is an issue and who to call and how to resolve that to really help deal with that issue. But otherwise, and again, in Cottage Grove, yes, in Cottage Grove, when we did that project, we said we are going to make a priority to select folks who are members of this community because we built it for that community. And so we got lots of inquiries from people outside of Cottage Grove, people from Eugene in particular said, I'd love to live in Cottage Grove. And we said, no, sorry. Priority goes to the local folk first. Now, if we can't find anyone, then we'll broaden the net to look at other places. Andy, anything else we should say about that?
I think you covered it.
All right, thank you. Thank you for those details. I had a question here. Is there a public housing authority in Eugene?
Yes, it's called Homes for Good. And in fact, their office is right next to ours. We frequently are involved in conversation with them. They do a lot of good work in our community. But they're not involved directly in the work that we do.
Okay, all right, thank you. Another question was, can you describe the support services offered at these various villages?
So our philosophy has been that we try as best we can to enable the villagers to manage the project. This is not what you would call a PSH, permanent supportive housing. Due to the nature of that, because if you have someone with very severe issues, particularly severe mental illness that causes a lot of disruption, we don't have the staffing, honestly, to deal with that, and that becomes a problem for the whole community. So we're very honest about that this is not that kind of project where we offer a lot of that kind of support. We do other things, like, for instance, we are what you might call a food bank agency. We work with the local food bank. We are a distribution center, so we can help the villagers in obtaining food. We work with our healthcare providers. We've had teams of healthcare people that come in, especially during the pandemic, would come in a couple of times a month to check on the health of people. We have had times where we've referred people to other public agencies, particularly in getting help with addiction issues, where we've said, hey, let's be honest here, you've got an issue, you really need more help than what we can provide for you here. We've worked very closely with a couple of different groups at the University of Oregon. who've come in to either build things for us or to do some project with a class, and then provided some benefit for our villagers. We have had up until recently a internship program for people seeking a degree in Master of Social Work. And so we've had that person who provides housing navigation services. So meeting with our villagers to work on their housing plan. Unfortunately, the two institutions we worked with have both gotten out of the business and don't offer that program anymore. So now we're having to hire our own housing navigator. And we recently got funding to provide a half-time staff person just to do that in our non-congregate shelter program. And our housing program, other than the food and hooking up folks to make sure they're getting enough food, there's not much else that I can think of, unless Andy, you have any other thing you can think of.
Yeah, I would just add with Emerald Village, when we opened that, the monthly cost was $250 to $350 a month, and what we found was that the vast majority of the initial residents were older, 60 or older, and it was because they were on what's it? It's skipping my mind now.
Social Security or disability?
SSI, yeah, where they had about $700 to $800 a month, which is what you get when you are an older citizen in America, but it's not enough to afford a basic studio apartment. So, these are older folks who just simply had a very, very low income and didn't have a place to live. And so there's a pretty good population out there that is either currently homeless or at risk of becoming homeless that doesn't have significant mental or addiction issues. And so I think this is an important model, in addition, side by side with the permanent supportive housing model. Permanent supportive housing, you have to be homeless for at least a year. You have to develop a disabling condition. So if that's all we're building, we're kind of waiting for people to break before offering housing. I think we need to do more than that.
Thank you.
And that's a really good point. I just want to add to that, because in the work that we are doing with unsheltered folk, one of the complaints I often hear from people is, I'm not disabled enough. And they see these people with all these other conditions, and particularly people with severe mental health and addiction issues, get housing, and they don't. We're not providing near enough housing for anyone, and I think it's overdone, but still there's that perception that no one will help me because I'm not this or I'm not that. And so providing that kind of housing for folk whose their only issue is that they're just very low income. And they're still good community members. They're doing their best. One of the folks that lives at Emerald Village, I actually knew when I was in seminary. His wife was a student at the same seminary, and unfortunately went through a divorce a number of years later. But here was someone who was a colleague of mine, just a very normal, everyday, person, but very low income. And, where else can you get housing and support for someone whose only issue is they just don't have the income?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really liking hearing your model after we've heard Amber's last week at Community First Village in Austin, because it's like these are all recipes that have different ingredients, and they have different, there's the same heart and intent, but you add things to subtract things to get what works best for your community. Which one of the questions was around, I know you have now a housing navigator. Do you have anyone there helping with addiction issues, counseling in that way in any of your villages?
No, again, yeah, we don't provide that service. What we do is we connect people up with other existing services when they need those. And quite a number of our, particularly in our non-congregate shelter, a number of those individuals do have a caseworker or a counselor or involved in some kind of program. And, we have folks that are in 12-step programs and things of that nature. So we don't provide it directly, but work with other agencies that do.
Thank
And
you.
let me just say one more thing about the similarity between us and community first is the village concept. That what we're both trying to do is create community, a place where you get support from other members of your community. That's a kind of a peer support program. And we have seen that materialize in so wonderful ways of folk that come together that maybe didn't know each other before they came to our village, and then develop relationships that become lifelong relationships. And those with vehicles provide transportation for those that don't. Babysitting for one, not babysit, pet sitting is a frequent thing. Someone has a pet, someone else takes care of their pet while they're off doing things. Just sharing of resources in a variety of different ways, and just having that friendship and camaraderie of living together is just a wonderful thing, and is a great value of the type of work that we're doing.
Thank you. And what kind of opportunity are there for volunteers at these various villages?
So when our first project, as I say, we had no staff when we built Opportunity Village. It was 100% volunteers, with the exception of one carpenter that we hired to provide some assistance in the building. Then with Emerald Village, again, over half of those homes were all built by volunteers, different groups. Like we had Rotary that did one group. We had different construction firms that, while they might have been employees, in many cases they weren't paid. They volunteered their time to build this. That their business would build it. Churches that came in and organized folk. Cottage Village, because in a rural community, we didn't have quite as many resources to draw on, but we had a local committee of local community members that put in a lot of hours into that project. And then, just the nonprofit itself, volunteers who get involved in our fundraising efforts and some of the other things that we do. Now we have a staff, so we're not quite as dependent as we once were in the first few years. Andy and I were volunteers for our first couple of years before we became staff members, so definitely is very much a grassroots organization.
So a lot more volunteers needed at the front end in the building. And then once they're up and running, they're more self-sufficient because of the community co-op.
Correct. The co-ops, right, are self-running. I mean, we do have a part-time staff person that assists with the administrative duties of the co-op to help with, their paperwork and just make sure that everything runs smoothly. But otherwise, they are completely self-sufficient, and they pay for themselves. There's no fundraising to support the co-ops once they're up and running. All of our fundraising is either just for the nonprofits itself, or for building the projects, or for running our non-congregation shelter, because those are still dependent on outside funding sources.
Thank you. I had a couple more questions around your housing authority. Does your housing authority access federal funds for housing vouchers? The other one that's okay, go ahead.
So the Emergency Solutions Grant in particular, and particularly during the pandemic, there were a number of additional vouchers that we were able to take advantage of. And working through the Housing Authority, I think I'd have, don't quote me on the numbers, but if I remember right from our program director, we had 14 people in the last year that were housed out of our 30 some that we have at Opportunity Village as a direct result of those housing vouchers. That is one of the major paths out of the shelter program, is through a housing voucher, Section 8, something of that nature. Probably accounts for over half of the folks who transition out is because of some kind of public assistance.
Thank you. So most of these tiny houses are really built for single people or couples, correct? You don't.
Andy talked about our under homes.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, a lot of singles and couples. We have some single parents in our Cottage Village and C Street project. And then with our Peace Village project, which we're about to build, we also have some 2-bedroom units. So we're kind of expanding a little bit in that regard. Since there's 70 units, we wanted to have a greater mix. But as Dan was showing with the wait list times on that one slide, like we really feel a lot of the effort is already focused on families. And when you look at the need, the biggest need is singles and couples in most communities. So we've been trying to fill that niche there.
Thank you. I loved the church, Presbyterian church or whichever that approached you.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, it got me thinking how many faith communities have a lot of property around their building that could house a small little village. It doesn't
Or
have
a
to be
large
70
one.
units, right?
Yeah.
10 units.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And there are also some tax incentives too. At least in Oregon, our legislature last year passed a bill to extend the religious property tax exemption to housing projects. So it used to be that if you built at the church, if you build a housing project, because it was not a religious, you weren't engaged in religious activity, you had to pay property tax. That is no longer the case in the state of Oregon. So if you want to build housing on your church-owned property, you don't have to pay property tax. So that's a huge incentive for more religious organizations to get into the housing business as just a natural extension of their ministry, as is the case with this Peace Presbyterian Church. They see it as part of their legacy of providing affordable housing for low-income individuals.
Yeah, that's really lovely. We are coming up on the top of the hour, and I know that people that are here and those that will listen later are wondering about replication. This is, a great model, a terrific recipe. How do people learn more about your recipe and how it's going? You have a fabulous website. Can you just share more about that with folks, please?
Andy, talk about the toolbox on our website.
Yeah, so we do have the Village Toolbox, which we created a few years ago to kind of share some of the information that we use to develop our projects to help others, kind of get started. So for like our co-op projects, we have our bylaws and the proprietary leases and those types of documents. I think that's helpful for folks to kind of see all the documents that go into creating a project before kind of getting started. And, that's how we looked at other projects to help to provide precedent for our projects. And we like to do that too. We also recently created villagemodel.org, which is a separate website that really goes into more detail on the ownership structure that I was talking about. We got a grant to kind of further research and develop that ownership structure, and are working to share and expand more interest in cooperative housing.
And when I was
right on, put the links in the chat there.
And when I was looking at your website, you even had like the plans of the different houses.
Yeah, we do have some tiny house plans available. Yep.
Yeah, so that was
there is some proprietary information that we do ask a donation for, so as a way to support the nonprofit, but it doesn't have to be a large donation, but we encourage folk to take advantage of that resource.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I think I'm going to double check. I think we got everyone's questions and the ones that I jotted down. Oh, have people from other states come to tour your village? And lots.
we're constantly doing, we had to cut back during the pandemic, and our villagers were feeling, a little bit like living in a fishbowl. But we do regularly schedule tours. So folks are, just get in touch with us and we'd be glad to set something up.
Okay, lovely. That's good for our viewers to know. That's it. You hit my questions and the questions of everyone that joined us today. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And, just to let everybody else know that, and especially people that are watching this without checking out the chat, the website has an insane amount of information. I invite everyone to visit. It's squarevillage.org. And the one for the village model is villagemodel.org. Pay attention to our website. We'll have a blog entry about this video, and like all this information will be up there as well. But again, this video will be uploaded to YouTube, and then will also be on Facebook Live on Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific.
Wow. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you,
For the
Dan.
opportunity. And thank you for all the work that you're doing on this. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, everybody else, thank you so much. And we'll see you next week. We will have Camille, Winnie, and the team of the Other Side Village or Other Side Academy from Salt Lake City, Utah, presenting their own project as well. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.